You're listening to Parasearch Radio, news, views and reviews from the world of the paranormal from across the UK and beyond. Find us on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web. Parasearch UK Radio. Parasearch Radio, broadcasting to the UK and beyond.
The views and opinions expressed by presenters and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Parasearch Radio or its affiliates and sponsors. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Haunted Histories with your host Penny G. Morgan, right here on Parasearch Radio.
Good evening everybody, and welcome to another episode of Haunted Histories here on Parasearch Radio with me, your host, Penny G. Morgan. Last week we visited the Jeffrey Museum with Fright Nights London, and what many of you didn't realise is that whilst I was recording the interview with them, an absolutely massive spider landed next to my arm. But being the true professional that I am, I didn't make a sound, as you probably couldn't even tell on the recording, although a very large squeal with an accompanying swear word was brewing. I then flicked said spider across the room and carried on the interview without an ounce of hesitation. I'm really hoping the same thing doesn't happen again, tonight or another night, as I cannot be guaranteed to not start to take the assault personally from the arachnid population. But it just goes to show that it's a dangerous job being a Parasearch presenter. Anyway, we mentioned that Fright Nights London were visiting Fort Horsted in October and November this year. If this is a place that's on your to-do list, I'd to-do it sooner rather than later, as the management team are stepping down, and who knows whether their replacements will want to carry on allowing paranormal investigations of the place. I'm not saying they will, I'm not saying they won't, but this is such a fantastic venue. It would be a real shame to miss out, don't you think? If you do want to go, have a look for Fright Nights London on Facebook, have a like of their page, and maybe book in for one of the 2 visits to Horsted. They've also got another visit to the Jeffrey in November, and considering the activity they had on their first ever investigation there in July, that one will most likely be a pretty interesting experience. If you don't know the activity to which I'm referring, have a listen to last week's show on the Spreaker app. I guess I should say at this point that all Parasearch shows are available to listen to on there, not just Haunted Histories. Although, listen to mine first, seeing as I'm the one telling you, please. Anyway, who listened to my show on Drakelow Tunnels a few weeks back? Yes? No? That one's still available too. Just saying. Anyway, I was putting together a future show last week on the island of Poveglia in Italy. Yes, doing it in quite advance for various reasons. But the broadcast date for that one is the 27th of September, November, that would be in advance, wouldn't it? 27th of September, if my memory serves correctly. And chatting to my guests for that show, Jeanette and Pamela Worley of Ghost Followers, who have been to Poveglia a few times, we got talking off air about other places we had investigated and enjoyed, and they mentioned Drakelow. Well, I said, I've been there, and we did a show on it. Jeanette mentioned that when she went there, she had a video camera going, and as I think I said to you during the show, again, if you haven't listened to it, you can, it's pitch black. There's no lights, no electricity switched on when you're there for an investigation. No lights, nothing, and it's underground, so there's no artificial light either. Well, when Jeanette was reviewing her footage, she saw a couple of lights She said that she wouldn't really describe them just as orbs. It was more like a few lights flying towards the lens of the camera, actually coming in a straight line directly towards it. Now, whether you believe in orbs or think they can all be dealt with a good vacuum and attack that dust, to have them coming in a direct line towards you when you review your footage would probably be quite unnerving. So who knows what they were. The other thing they had, and I believe it was when they were using a digital voice recorder, it could even have been the video camera, I may have got that one wrong, was the sound of an engine. When they listened closer, it actually sounded like a conveyor belt. Now, if you remember the history of the place, 2 of the deaths that occurred there were 2 workmen who died during the excavation of the tunnel when they rode the conveyor out of the building and got trapped and crushed within it. Spooky, huh? They told me that they didn't know the conveyor story until afterwards, and that other people have commented on how much it sounds like a sort of building type conveyor, as well as those who knew nothing about the tunnel's gruesome history. A brilliant catch to get on your digital recorder or something. But that's one I've never heard of. I'd never found that one, so that was an interesting one to hear. And I guess we'll never know. Bit of a coincidence though, isn't it? When you think about it. Anyway, Jeanette and Pamela will be back on the 27th of September to talk with us about Pavelia and the things they experienced there. It's not going to be one that you want to miss. It's a fascinating place. But tonight, where are we going? Where are we going on our Haunted Histories tour? Well, we're going to the south coast and to Dorset. But before I tell you the name of the village, if you haven't remembered from the actual ads of the show, how would you feel if in November 1943 you received this letter? You received a letter which said this: "In order to give our troops the fullest opportunity to perfect their training in the use of modern weapons of war, the Army must have an area of land particularly suited to their special needs and in which they can use live shells. For this reason you will realise the chosen area must be cleared of all civilians. The most careful search has been made to find an area suitable for the Army's purpose, and which at the same time will involve the smallest number of persons and property. The area decided on, after the most careful study and consultation between all the government authorities concerned, lies roughly inside of the square formed by East Lulworth, East Stoke, East Home and Kimmeridge Bay, including your property. It is regretted that in the national interest it is necessary to move you from your homes, and everything possible will be done to help you, both by payment of compensation and by finding other accommodation for you if you are unable to do so yourself. The date which the military will take over this area is the 19th of December next, and all civilians must be out of the area by that date. A special office will be opened at Westport House, Wareham, on Wednesday the 17th of November, and you will be able to get advice between the hours of 10 a.m. and 7 p.m. from there on your personal problems and difficulties. Any letters should be sent to that address also for the present. The government appreciate that this is no small sacrifice which you are asked to make, but they are sure that you will give this further help towards winning the war with a good heart." Now this was the letter which triggered the move of the 225 residents of Tyneham village in Dorset, albeit supposedly temporary, in the period of the month from 16th of November 1943 to the 19th of December 1943. That whole part of Dorset is very heavily militarised, with the Bovington Tank Museum and camp being just a stone's throw away, and the extension of the gunnery ranges was primarily for the training of crews in Sherman tanks. Yes, the same Sherman we talked about when I talked to Cheryl Sefcik about Gettysburg. These tanks were in the process of being carried across the Atlantic in their hundreds to be deposited in the UK. But Bovington And Lulworth camps in themselves have a very interesting history if we talk about the area in general surrounding Tyneham. The camps at Bovington and Lulworth were originally established in 1899 as an infantry training area and ranges. In 1916, they became training camps for the heavy branch of the Machine Gun Corps, which relocated from Norfolk. The heavy branch was responsible for the operation of the tank in the British Army. In 1917, the heavy branch split from the Machine Gun Corps to become the Tank Corps, with the depot and central schools being based at Bovington. T.E. Lawrence, not the Lawrence who wrote Lady Chatterley's Lover, a different one, who became known as Lawrence of Arabia, died very near that camp after he was fatally injured in a motorcycle accident when he swerved to avoid two boys riding their bikes. Although even this story has different versions, as the two boys maintain they don't remember any of it, and an officer, or a soldier, who was based nearby, has actually said that he saw a black sort of van come swerving round the corner, which disappeared, and he believes it was that knocked Lawrence off his motorbike. It sparked many conspiracy theories due to the somewhat clandestine work that Lawrence had done in World War I, and the fact he'd quite abruptly left the army. In fact, Lawrence is actually said to be one of the rumoured spirits said to haunt that part of Dorset. So for what reason did the Ministry of Defence commandeer the village and the other surrounding areas back then in 1943? If you know the area, you'll know that Tyneham is part of the Lulworth firing range, a part of the British Army where soldiers can take armoured vehicles, tanks obviously included, to practice firing. You can actually access walks across there, and I have many memories as a child making the walk on a summer's day when the range was not in operation, funnily enough, down to Warbarrow Bay, which is where my parents liked to go and lie on the beach in our summer holidays when we used to holiday in Dorset every single year. We also used to visit Lulworth Cove, but you don't have to access Lulworth Cove via the firing ranges. But it is quite an interesting place, and it's massive. Over 3,000 acres or something, I believe. But back to why the area was actually taken over, albeit, as the villagers believed, temporary. D-Day. It's all down to D-Day, the preparation for D-Day. The main forces gathering in that part of Dorset were the 2nd United States Armoured Division, who would be setting sail to Normandy as the beachheads were secured in the invasion of Europe in June 1944. 6th of June 1944 to be precise. There were to be 5 beaches breached during the invasion, and they were known as Utah, Omaha, Juno, Gold and Sword. And intelligence suggested that the Dorset beaches were a very close match to what they would be expected to land on in June. Most of us probably know what happened on D-Day, even if you don't know the actual hard facts. I'll be surprised if you haven't seen something like Saving Private Ryan, and I believe that was based on the storming of the Omaha Beach. Those military forces encamped in the area were codenamed Force O. They were the ones who would take on the bloodiest of the Normandy landings, Omaha Beach. Omaha was the most heavily defended of the 5 beaches and was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division. They faced the 352nd Infantry Division rather than the expected single regiment. Strong currents forced many landing craft east of their intended positions or caused them to be delayed. For fear of hitting the landing craft, American bombers delayed releasing their payload, and as a result, most of the beach obstacles at Omaha remained undamaged when the men came ashore. Many of the landing craft ran aground on sandbars, and the men had to wade 50 to 100 metres in water up to their necks, whilst under fire to get to the beach. In spite of the rough seas, amphibious Sherman tanks known as DD tanks of 2 companies of the 741st Tank Battalion were dropped 5,000 yards, which is around 4,600 metres, from the shore. However, 27 of the 32 flooded and sank, with the loss of 33 crew. Some tanks disabled on the beach continued to provide covering fire until their ammunition ran out, or they were swamped by the rising tide. Now, if you've ever looked in a tank, they're not the easiest things to get out of if you're in trouble, especially the older ones. It's quite claustrophobic. Around 34,000 troops were landed on Omaha, out of around 150,000 Allied troops in total. Casualties were at around the 2,000 mark as they began, as the men were subjected to fire from the cliffs above. Problems clearing the beach of obstructions led to the beachmaster calling a halt to further landings of vehicles at 8:30 in the morning, or 08:30 hours. A group of destroyers arrived around this time to provide fire support so landings could resume. However, exit from the beach was possible only via heavily defended gullies, and by late morning barely 600 men had reached the higher ground. Bear in mind, this is from something like 34,000 troops. Only 600 of them managed to make it to the higher ground. By noon, as the artillery fire took its toll and the Germans started to run out of ammunition, the Americans were able to clear some lanes on the beaches. They also started clearing the gullies of enemy defences so that vehicles could move off the beach. The tenuous beachhead was expanded over the following days, and the D-Day objectives for Omaha were accomplished, D+3, or in effect 3 days after the initial landing. If you look on the D-Day Museum website, they will tell you that there was around 3,700 American casualties attributable to Omaha alone, and this doesn't include the air support, the aeroplanes that were brought down, excuse me, or the naval people who were included. So, with this level of commitment, you can perhaps understand why the villagers of Tyneham were prepared to do their bit for the war. But they did expect to be allowed to return after the war had finished, and had left an incredibly moving note on their church door when the last family left the little hamlet. Please treat the church and houses with care. We have given up our homes where many of us have lived for generations to help win the war, to keep men free. We shall return one day, and thank you for treating the village kindly. However, a couple of years after the war had finished in December 1947, then Prime Minister Clement Attlee and his government admitted that although they had promised that Tyneham would be returned to its residents at the end of the emergency, that the extended firing ranges were part of the War Office's gains from the Second World War, and it was not going to give them away. After a public inquiry in 1948, the then War Minister, John Strachey, upheld the decision in the interest of national interest. Bear in mind, they were concerned about things like the Cold War coming, and so a lot of the sort of military things that had been established during World War II, they were loath to give away. Over the next 25 years, many of the buildings continued to deteriorate, with the 19th century rectory being burnt down in 1966. The beautiful Tyneham house, which is set slightly apart from the village, that was the home of the Bond family, who were, I suppose you could say, the owners of Tyneham, were the lords of the manor, which ironically had actually been used as a billet for members of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force during World War II. It was gradually demolished. The Army, the MOD, stating that it wasn't worth doing any of the repairs on it to keep it, I suppose, looking good, I suppose you could say. This could actually be seen as a massive loss to the historical heritage of that area, as it was an amazing building when it was intact. In fact, sadly, the last Bond to own the property, Ralph, who inherited it in 1935, died in 1951, a broken man by all accounts at the loss of his home, and devastated by the broken promises of the government to give the village back to its inhabitants. From the late 1960s a group was formed to try and get Tyneham given back to its original owners. But, and this may seem a cruel comment on my part, but it's something that my parents and I, as their regular visitors to the place, have discussed at length. How many people who actually lived there are still around? Bear in mind the average age of people who would have been living there in 1943 probably would have been in their 30s and 40s. I doubt there are many, if any, and most are more likely to be descendants of people who were sort of born and bred in Tyneham, as opposed to people who lived there prior to the forced move. I would also question, sort of a bit sarcastically, but I would, who wants to live somewhere that is in the middle of a live firing range? And not just any old firing range, the major firing practice range for tank warfare. Maybe a bit tough to get a good night's sleep when they were practicing, eh? What I couldn't find out whilst doing my research was the kind of compensation that the former residents were given. And whilst a broken promise is something that can cause great angst, it's also a shame to see an area which has been lived in, reportedly, since the Roman times, and certainly was mentioned in the Doomsday Book, see that sort of place turned into what is basically a giant war game. But, and there is a but coming, isn't there always? There has been massive restoration to the area, and you can visit it when the range is not in operation. I'll be honest, I don't remember ever visiting it as a child, but as my parents are regular visitors there even now. And I've said that whilst it is eerie because it does seem to be a place where time has stood still, many of the buildings, whilst stable and safe to look in and go in, have no roofs. And that the guides can tell you all about the history of the area and what happened, and apparently they do tell you it in quite a lot of depth. My mum has said it's very interesting. But it is a shame that possibly the most infamous ghost village in the UK that actually still has a census carried out on it, and is, I believe, the only one with a census of 0, still stands empty. Although it wasn't the only village or area that was commandeered for war use, there's quite a few dotted around the country. It does seem to be one that still produces many feelings of emotion in those whose ancestors used to live there, and possibly devastation at the broken promises of the British government that they would give it back, and yet people never got to go back or be buried in the church that they wanted to be. Right. In part 2, we'll look at some of the paranormal experiences and, dare I say it, ghost tales of the area, and I'll interpret some of the information found on investigations of Tyneham, and also look at some of its surrounding areas, such as Bovington and Lulworth and the such. But don't go anywhere. Harry wants a quick word.
Hello, Harry Price here. Good evening. If there's nothing myself and everybody else enjoy here on the other side more is the sit back and relax and listen to Parasearch Radio with its paranormal news, views and reviews from across the UK and beyond. Make sure to find out more about them on Facebook, Twitter and the World Wide Web, whatever they are, to keep up to date with all their broadcasts throughout the week. And I hope you enjoy them as much as we do over here. Hello? Is anybody there?
And we're back. Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us. Now, we've been talking about Lulworth and Bovington and the Tyneham ghost village, although it's not actually called a ghost village because it's full of ghosts. It's called a ghost village because it's deserted, which a lot of paranormal investigators like to play on the whole ghost aspect of it. But let's look at some of the stories associated with this. Now, the first I want to pay homage to was what some of the actual men stationed at Lulworth were preparing for the beaches of Normandy, and specifically Omaha project operation. Well, they were the Omaha group. Now, I found a couple of paranormal accounts on the internet, and these actually read, and they were really interesting, and I'm actually going to read them in the first person, so I'm going to read them as they're written. So in a minute when I'm talking about my wife, I haven't divorced my husband and got married again, although she would be a lucky girl. I'm reading from here. So, me and my wife went to Omaha Beach in Normandy. It's about a 2-hour train ride from Paris and was incredible. For those who don't know, Omaha is one of the beaches where the D-Day invasions took place during World War II. If I remember correctly, there were 8,000 casualties at that location. So, because I love history, especially World War II history, I wanted to go and explore the bunkers. These bunkers, however, are not preserved very well and are disappearing into the earth, but I was able to go into a few. I took a bunch of photos with my phone of the bunkers and the surrounding beach, but one bunker I went into had one entrance and no open windows and was pitch black inside. You walked into this concrete formation and took a left, and there was this room that was so dark I couldn't even see in front of my nose. So with my clever thinking, I took 2 photos with the flash on and just thought I would check them out later. Well, when we returned to our hotel in Paris, we were looking at the pictures and came to the pitch black bunker. That's when my wife noticed this face in this sort of opening, a sort of a window-esque thing in the bunker. It was chilling, to say the least, but was very, very interesting to me. Now, firstly, he's saying 8,000 casualties. Well, we mentioned earlier it wasn't actually meant to have been that many at Omaha, about half that, but it's still a fair number. And I had a look at these photos because he'd attached links to them on this sort of chat page that he'd put them on. And there's definitely something. It almost looks like a blob of some kind in the picture. It could be a face. The height of it would be about right for someone of probably about 5'7", 5'8", peering through a window. But then again, it could just be pareidolia. I don't know. But with the loss of life there in such violent circumstances, would a spirit checking out a stranger be unusual? Especially if that stranger was American and had gone into a German bunker. Which those bunkers would have been, wouldn't they? They were German. I also found a lot of sort of one-line accounts of people feeling like they were being watched as they walked back to their cars. No real proof or any sort of methods of scientific investigations that I've seen, and to be honest, I don't think investigating the Normandy beaches as a paranormal investigator would go down very well with the loss of life and everything that was there. However, for you to feel that someone's watching you, it's normally a good indication that someone is, because most true investigators will say that the human body is probably the best piece of equipment that you'd ever need, and the sensitivity and stuff. But I found this account as well, and I'm going to read it as written, but just to get you into the whole framework of what was going on in D-Day, have a listen to this quick little soundbite. Yes, my soundbites are back. Has that made you think of D-Day and what they were going through? I thought it was pretty evocative. But anyway, so I found this account, and this is quite a long one, but stick with it because it's absolutely intriguing, and I wish I could contact the person who put it to ask them more. But again, I'm reading it as written. So, well, the first area we were actually able to see German bunkers were Pont du Hoc, which has renamed as it was since the US Army Rangers took it from the Germans on D-Day. My daughter at the time was 7. Now she's 8. A lifetime by any means for a child. Remember how long it took for Christmas to come again. So her memories are clear, and the images in her mind very fresh at this young age. We toured many bunkers and escape tunnels, her and I, while my wife watched. She doesn't like this stuff. Many times the bunker was totally dark with no light, other than me taking flash pictures and lighting it up for a brief second, so we could not see anything specific. I guess they keep it dark to keep sightseers from sticking around. So long story short, we saw a ton of bunkers and all kinds of old blown up stuff. But one thing I will point out now, my daughter has never seen what a German soldier looks like, or the weapons they carried. I have no pictures of them. Nowhere in my house is there anything she could relate to the look of them. And when I play any World War II PC games, she is not allowed to watch me or be in the room with me. My wife's orders. You get the point? Nil exposure. Onwards to last night. Over the past year, my daughter has often spoken of things or men that she saw looking at her, pointing guns at her, and following her while we were in the bunkers and around the Normandy area. She often describes them as crouching down, hiding behind corners, holding guns and looking as if they were very mad. Finally, I decided it was time to prod her a little more as she is 1 year older and might be able to describe better what she saw. So I began to ask her about it, what she saw. Mind you, stop here if you don't want your hair to stand up. Now, I am ever the skeptic, a complete non-believer, the prove-it type of guy. I'll often tell you right to your face you're full of... Well, yeah, you get what I'm about to say. If I really don't believe a word you're saying, which is actually most of the time. So this was a challenge for me to believe as well. I kept an open mind. We were driving to go to dinner, just the two of us, as my wife attends college classes on Tuesday nights. So it's a date night, so to speak. So these were my questions in the car while we were driving. What did it look like? They were mad and wearing either grey or very darkish green. No, definitely some kind of greyish colour. The helmets were even darker. Were there a lot of them? Yes, hiding behind trees and in the bunkers, in all the little corners or behind the walls, crouched down or kind of kneeling. Did they have nice uniforms or were they loose? The uniforms were nice, with lots of buttons on the front and things on the shoulders. OK, how about medals? Anything on the head or chest? Yes, something like a circle with a star in it, on the chest. Were you scared? Yes, but I knew they weren't trying to hurt me, so I didn't think anything of it. But there were a lot of them. Everywhere I looked, they were moving around like army men do, kind of crawling but bent over. When we'd walk out of a bunker, I could see one in the grass or behind a tree. Then when I was in the car, I could see them looking at me from behind a fence in the field. Sometimes a lot of them, sometimes only one or two. Why didn't you say something to me? I couldn't. I didn't know what they were. I knew they weren't real, so you wouldn't believe me anyway. Were there different types? Yes, some had different colours, like a dark colour and a greenish colour. By this time, I gave it a rest, grabbed a pen and paper and went in for some food. Panera bread for those in the US. Great food. As we settled down to eat, I asked her to draw some of the stuff and to try and see what she saw in her head. What she drew scared the hell out of me. I asked about the gun the soldier was carrying. She proceeded to draw what resembled the MP40. She then tried to draw the helmet but couldn't get it right. I then drew the front view of a standard German helmet. She said that was it. It was pointy at the sides when you looked straight at it. I asked her about boots. She said she thought so, but could not tell as they were never standing up, which is true. Most German combat poses are crouched down and running. Next was the camouflage, which was insane. I asked her to first draw what she thought the soldier was wearing. She drew a German tunic. She said it was tight and looked very nice, not sagging, and had buttons. She drew the medal right where it should be on the right breast. Next she began to describe the colours and shapes of the camouflage. He looked different than the others. He was in the bushes and had a very dark helmet, a really big gun, bigger than the others, and his clothes were funny colours, like something green and a dark colour with different shapes. I don't know, I can't describe it. After this we left. I kept the paper and we went to the library. I found a World War II book with a lot of pictures in it. I showed her pictures of the British, American and German soldiers. She pointed out the German soldiers right away. That's the helmet, that's the jacket and that's the gun. I showed her a colour drawing of the MP40 amongst a bunch of other World War II weapons on the same page. She immediately picked it out of the page. Now it gets even better. We went home and I went on the internet. I found a picture of a 12-inch doll of a... I don't know how you pronounce this, sorry, Fallschirmjäger. What I forgot to mention was when she described, then drew the helmet of the other soldier, the one that looked different, she said the helmet was very dark and had a chin strap that was easy to see, and wrapped around under the chin very, very tight. When she drew the picture of it, it looked different, that other helmet. She said it was not pointy on the sides, it was flat, small and tight to the head. I showed her the picture of him. She said, "That's what he looked like. That's the helmet, Daddy. And his jacket looks the same." I'll stop here. There is more, especially about the medal. It was the unit designation badge that all German soldiers wear. She pointed out that the circle was the oak leaves when I showed her a picture of the unit badges. Again, my daughter had never seen pictures of World War II soldiers other than her great-uncle's 82nd Airborne Mess uniform. She had no idea what these men look like, nor do I watch anything related to war on the TV when she's home. She's a fun-loving, goofy, energetic kid that always has a smile on her face and is very happy simply to be alive. When we talked about this, she was happy to tell me and gave me as much detail as possible. She was not afraid and never once thought twice about describing what she saw. I have nothing else to think, but everything she says and saw is 100% true. Doesn't that just make the hairs on your neck stand up listening to that account? I know it did for me when I found it and I started reading it through. To have your child have that kind of experience, it must be so hard to know what to do, whether to talk to them about it, whether to ask them about it even, or just to sort of dismiss it and say, nah, it didn't really happen. I think it's amazing. I think it's absolutely amazing that child experienced that. But I actually don't think we need to explore Omaha any more than that. You only have to look at photos of the area from 1944 to be left with enough haunting images in your mind that, well, just that. It's a very, very haunting images and haunting mind, especially when you can get hold of those photos that overlay the 1940s images onto present day. And not to mention when there was the memorials recently and they had all the shadows of the bodies on the beaches. I found that one incredibly moving. So on to Bovington. What do we have at Bovington? Now, Bovington is not only home to the tank regiment, it's also the place of a very interesting tank museum. Now, I know you may think interesting tank museum is an oxymoron, but it is absolutely fascinating and has tanks from way back to the First World War from different nations. Well, interestingly enough, a lot of those tanks are genuine artifacts. They're not sort of mock-ups or rebuilds of anything. And there have been sightings of a German soldier who locals have affectionately called Hermann the German around a Tiger 131 tank. He is seen walking around in his grey uniform and peering into his tank, and sometimes even his face is seen at the windows of the museum when it's locked up at night. Looking into the story of Hermann the German, I did actually find some reports that Hermann was in fact a story concocted by a former curator of the museum in the 1960s who wanted to keep, shall we say, inquisitive young minds away from the property at night so as not to damage the historical artefacts that were in there. Although, interestingly enough, another story I found said that when the tank was actually donated to the museum, a body of a German soldier was actually found buried deep inside it. Whether that's true, whether Hermann exists, or whether Hermann is just, well, a figment of someone's imagination even, I don't know. But that said, it wouldn't surprise me one iota if the tank museum had quite a lot of spirits loitering there. With all those machines of destruction and war in one place, there's got to be something attached to one of them, wouldn't you think? But it is a fascinating museum, and it's, when I mentioned earlier about tanks being quite constricted, and you know those poor men who drowned in the amphibious Sherman tanks when they were being dropped at the D-Day beaches, that you can actually, well, you used to be able to actually climb into a tank to see how constricted it would be, and they also had a cutaway of one of the original World War I tanks and showed you weren't getting out of that thing if you got hit. You were stuck. So not a job I'd particularly want to do if I was in the armed forces. But anyway, some of the other things before we get on to talking about Tyneham itself is Dorset does actually have a lot of history. For example, Sir Walter Raleigh is actually meant to haunt one of the properties there, Sherborne Castle, I believe, as the anniversary of his death comes up. But another equally dashing figure, which I mentioned earlier from the 20th century, Lawrence of Arabia, is said to revisit his former home at somewhere called Clouds Hill. Now, Lawrence was an Oxford-educated archaeologist working in Iraq when the First World War, the Great War, broke out, and his fluency in Arabic identified him as someone who might be useful in the British Army's campaigns in the Middle East. However, the contribution that Lawrence made was actually far and above what anyone could actually have ever expected one man to be able to make in the theatre of war over in Arabia. And you could say his bravery, his tactical genius and empathy with desert tribes brought him a lot of successes against the Arabs' common foe, the Turks. He was featured in lots of different magazines and articles and everything else, and after the whole sort of excitement of doing war service, Colonel Lawrence actually found it very hard to settle down, which a lot of people do. He joined the RAF even incognito under an assumed name, and then moved to Dorset, where he sort of shut himself off and lived a bit as a hermit at the Clouds Hill cottage near Wareham, which you can actually go to visit. It's a bit tiny, but you can visit it. Well, I mentioned earlier that he got knocked off his motorbike. I don't know if you remember his Bros Superior motorbike, and it's blamed that it was the two young lads he swerved to avoid. However, somebody has seen, there's reports of a large black vehicle being seen at the same time that was never traced. Even more interestingly, that night, the night of Lawrence's death, someone broke into Clouds Hill, his home, and went through all his papers. And I don't mean newspapers. So there's something for the conspiracy theorists there. But anyway, his death was announced 5 days after his crash, because he actually held on for that long. And farmers reported hearing again the sound of his motorbike in the lanes. The sound was heard just before dawn, and the witnesses insisted that it was the exact sound of his bike, because it was quite a distinctive sound, and it couldn't be mistaken for any other motorcycle. And then subsequently there was claims of a figure in Arab dress that started to appear at the cottage after dark. Such was Lawrence's, I guess, reputation as a hero. It began to be rumoured that in the future his ghost would only appear when England was facing potential conflict or calamity. Now, this has been this sort of heroic kind of, I suppose, paranormal experience isn't only attributed to Lawrence. People such as Sir Francis Drake have also been given that particular accolade. But if you want to go and visit, if you're ever in Dorset and you want to go and visit it, it's actually the cottage is actually in the care of the National Trust, and I believe it's pretty much as Lawrence left it. So his personality is probably well enamoured in the place. Quite an interesting one. But on to Tyneham. Well, there's not many documented visits to this place. Now, whether this is because the group that manage it actively discourage investigators, I don't know. Or whether it's the fact that some of the buildings are ruins and have no roofs on them. Again, I don't know. I also know it's quite a walk, so that you don't get locked into the car park if you want to get there. So a lot of the evidence I found is from YouTube videos, primarily from two groups, Paranormal Vale and Dorset Ghost Hunters. So feel free to have a look at their videos and drop them a line and ask them any questions about the evidence that they found. Now, I won't be broadcasting any of the recordings because they are their recordings. It's not down to us to broadcast them on the radio. But I'm going to talk about some of the things that they experienced because it's quite interesting. Now, the first thing to note is that both these groups had the correct and proper permissions to be on site after hours. This is very, very important because when you listen to the Dorset Ghost Hunters one, you'll hear them being asked to leave because security has found out that there's live firing about to start on the range. And obviously Tyneham is bang in the middle, so you don't really want to be there when the big tanks start firing their live rounds of ammo at night in the dark to practice what they're going to do if they ever go away to war. But anyway, so Paranormal Veil. Well, one of the things I like to look at is what equipment different groups use, because there's also always the common denominator ones, but Paranormal Veil used an echo box, and I've never used one of these. I've never heard one used on an investigation that I've done. And if I'm being honest, listening to it, a lot of the answers they heard, I actually didn't. Or it almost sounded nonsensical. Now, I'm not saying they were making up what they heard. They were right next to it, and obviously there would have been a slight bit of distortion coming through on the cameras and everything else. But there was definitely a disembodied voice that said, "Come here," very faintly, which got picked up on, well, whether it was they heard it, I'm not sure, but it was definitely a voice, and you heard it very, very clearly on the video, which was an amazing catch. And 2 or 3 times you did actually hear what definitely sounded like "get out" on the echo box. And as we all know, anyone who does investigations, to get maybe 15 minutes of decent evidence probably takes a good 10 hours or more of work. So I would be interested to see more of what these guys discovered that they didn't put on their video on YouTube, because that disembodied voice was very clear and very easy to hear. I would also, be interested if they used any other bits of equipment to see what they could find. It's always interesting to use different bits of equipment, I find, if not to rely on just the one. But there was a definite disembodied voice, and I could definitely hear through the echo box "get out" more than once. Dorset Ghost focused more on using an ovilus, but they also use sound amplifiers, obviously to amplify the sounds that maybe the natural ear can't hear too easily. And they said through that sound amplification they had a lot of whispering, like conversations going on, but nothing that was interactive to them. So this quite feasibly could be some kind of residual haunting from when the village was occupied, and just an ongoing conversation that's going on. Bear in mind that a village that was around for probably about 1,000 years before it was deserted would not be a big shock to have some type of residual spirit there. And these might not even necessarily be spirits that were there, who lived there when they were sort of turfed out in the 1940s. These could have been people who were there 100, 200, 300 years ago. The interesting thing was that when they were talking, the box, the ovilus, said "think." And now the investigators, these guys were very good at asking questions. Now, when you get words coming through on an ovilus, or words coming through on a spirit box or an echo box, whatever it is you're using, when it's only single words, there is a certain amount of interpretation needed by the investigators. Now, some of the way they interpreted the words, I didn't necessarily agree with watching back, and I'll tell you about that one in a second. But one of the investigators then asked, "Well, what are you thinking about?" And the answer came straight back: life. So it was an intelligent answer. It was an ongoing conversation, and that was quite fascinating. And I know the ovilus and all these kind of equipment have their sort of naysayers and all of that, but to me, unless the video was cut together, and it definitely didn't look that way, that looked like an intelligent answer, that someone was sitting there thinking about life. They then were pointing at a kind of a motion sensor that they'd put up on the wall. Now, this video is about half an hour long, so I'm summarising bits for you, but do go on there and have a look at it, because both Paranormal Veil and Dorset Ghost Hunters, the videos, they give you a really good idea of how quiet and how peaceful this village, well, probably is until the tanks start firing over on the range. But anyway, they'd put this motion sensor up on the wall, and the ovilus, they were saying to the spirits, please come near it, set it off, it's not going to hurt you, look, we're setting it off now. And the word "hung" came through on the ovilus. Well, the first thing they thought of was nobody had been hung here before, not that I know of. Well, the thing that I was thinking of is it was saying the thing was hung on the wall. That was the the thing I got, but I wasn't there. It's just, again, you just interpret things in different ways. The guys then discovered almost what looked like a mini safe high up in the wall of the cottage they were in. I think it was Shepherd's cottage. And the ovulus said 15. And then it said men. Now this is the kind of sort of nonsensical answers that a lot of people criticise things like the ovulus for coming out with. They say it's just a random word generator and there is no logic to it. Well, one of the guys was looking at one of the pictures on the wall that's in a display, and he started counting the men on it. And there was 15 men in this picture that he'd been looking at when the ovulus came through and said 15 and men. They then started asking the ovulus, who is it I'm talking to? Can you point out to us? Who are we talking to? And with various answers, it kind of directed them to which one they were talking to. And it was an intelligent, reciprocal conversation. It was quite fascinating to watch, and it was another thing, it did make the hairs on my arm stand up. If it was fabricated, I would be disappointed. But it was a very interesting conversation, and it was very, very interactive. The two guys were both quite jumpy, as they kept hearing noises that they couldn't explain. But I couldn't hear them on the video. Maybe you could if you can get a better sound quality. But saying that, they said they could hear an engine, and there was like no reason why there would be an engine there. But I think that can be debunked slightly later when they tell us that the security guards told them that they've got to leave because the army are getting ready to start live firing, and the noise they heard, the engine noise, could well have been tank engines warming up because the noise of those travels quite a bit. Looking into any other reports I could find on Tyneham, there were reports of a man named Warren who resides there. But this name didn't come up in either of the group's investigations, or if so, it wasn't on their YouTube videos. But do check both of these groups out if what I have said whets your appetite. They're both quite interesting videos to watch, and they do, like I say, give you a really good idea of Tyneham and what it looks like. Do I think Tyneham is haunted? Probably. Most likely. I would like to see a group spend more time there on a regular basis and see what other evidence they can come up with in all of the different rooms there rather than just sticking to one specific building. But with the village, as I said, having been in existence for around 1,000 years, it is highly likely that something resides there. But what is the question? The building I would most like to investigate if I was there is actually the old Schoolhouse, because this is one of the few buildings that's totally restored and wasn't open to the investigators. Children would have attended there from 4 to 14, and depending on whether any of the furniture inside is actually genuine, I would expect there to be a lot of energy still surrounding it. Maybe one day I'll be able to convince the people who run the village to open it up and let some of us stay there for the night. So that's Tyneham and its surrounding areas. There's a hell of a lot of different history in the area, and Dorset is a fantastic county to visit if you're looking for a long weekend break or whatever. There's so many castles and forts and all that kind of thing to keep you amused, young and old. Next week, I'll be popping a little bit further north and looking at the Galleries of Justice with Julie of the lovely Haunted Happenings. But don't forget, you don't have to miss me too much. Parasearch has shows on every night of the week. KTPF Reload is tomorrow, and the Dark Mirror guys on Friday are going to be looking at paranormal beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. Should be an interesting one, eh? All that leaves me to say, though, is thank you for listening, good evening, sleep tight, and don't worry too much about things that go bump in the night.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to join us for more shows throughout the week. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and the World Wide Web to keep up to date with all the shows right here on Parasearch Radio.